Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So I just wanted to tell people I did
And
I
they've
did
changed
have
the
a little
format
bit
now.
of
It makes almost
a write up about you, but I also want to tell people, that a little bit about what you had sent to me, and I'll let you explain. Chris currently is the coordinator for Healthy Food for All, and let Chris explain what that is about. And half of his time he was officially on that job, and also the other part of his job is the manager of the Feed Kitchens, which is on the northeast side, and that's where some of the actual physical work is done that he's doing with food rescue and food recovery. And Chris also worked for Community Action Coalition and Fair Share CSA after a shift to the food career. And Chris, when was that shift that you made? I know you worked for the Dane County Jail and Head Start, you said, and then you kind of shifted over to food. What was the time when you started the?
That was early 2000, about 2004.
Okay, so it's been a good 6-7 years, right?
Correct.
Oh no, 16 years.
Yeah.
16. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, and I was impressed. I looked on the website. You can update us on this. You had the figure that you helped process or repurpose 125,000 pounds of food in 2018, and that roughly translated into the same number of meals, 1,205,000 meals. So we're interested, in that, in just the business in general and what the impact has been. So I hope you can give us some good ideas about what you're doing and what you see as some of the issues still. And you mentioned also that COVID has thrown some other twists into this mix. So
it certainly has. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm happy you're here. And like I said, I have the Healthy Food for All web page up. And if you have something that you want me to click on from there, just let me know.
All righty. I appreciate it. Thank you for the introduction. I wish I could see you all, because that makes speaking to you a lot easier. Still difficult via Zoom, but at least we can see each other doing that. I'm going to continue trying to click into this meeting while I'm talking. We're having some major connectivity issues here this morning, which obviously causes some stress, but here we go. So thank you for the introduction, Paul. Yep, I am. So officially, I am the manager of Feed Kitchens. I am based here at Feed Kitchens. I stay here full-time, actually probably more than full-time. And as part of that job, I also started and run Healthy Food for All through the same facility. Healthy Food for All, my activity with Healthy Food for All precedes my coming into Feed Kitchens as a manager. Sort of the trajectory of my career is, once I left kind of the employment and training arena back in 2004, it was because of welfare reform and not wanting to fund training anymore. I found myself unemployed. Ended up at Community Action Coalition. I had never worked in the food system really before. I guess I worked in a grocery store when I was in college, but that would be about it. But I did have management experience and nonprofit experience, and that's what got me hired there as the Food and Gardens Division Manager. Sort of coordinating food pantries in Dane, Jefferson, and Waukesha counties, running the Federal Emergency Food Assistance Program, Gleaners Food Recovery Program that was kind of a retail-based program, and then Community Gardens, and oversaw the expansion of Community Gardens in Dane County. In 2008, with the economic downturn, we were really struggling as pantry usage increased, as we're seeing now again, struggling with where we were going to get food. The average yearly visits to food pantries prior to the economic downturn in Dane County was about 85,000. 85,000 visits to food pantries. Pretty high, we had years before that, we had basically seen those numbers being very similar, so we thought we'd stabilize the issue and that we could start now working it down. Then the economic downturn came and food pantry usage jumped about, well, the year 2008, we saw 156,000 food pantry visits, so almost double. Number of visits looking for ways that we could procure food, and basically started looking with an eye towards the local food system and what was available here that we weren't already capturing. And we started looking at gardens, food pantry gardens, more in food waste and food recovery issues, trying to capture what was immediately available right under our noses to try to stock food pantries. And so that sort of event pushed me into thinking more about local foods, more about healthy food choices for folks, and thinking about how not only making healthy food choices available, but how do we get people then to make the choice that we want them to make, because we know that eating healthy helps with health outcomes, it helps with school outcomes, it helps with kids with behavioral outcomes. And so there's a lot of reasons that we want people to eat healthy, but there's what is the right approach to getting people to make those choices. Some people are going to naturally make those choices. If you were to believe sort of mainstream media or politicians, you might think that people are incapable of making healthy choices, and therefore we need to make those for them. And then that's when we see policy recommendations, things like restricting what people can buy with food stamps or something like that. So my personal belief is, instead of a stick, we offer a carrot. As we were recovering food from local farms, is the idea of washing that up, making it look nice, making it look like it would look in a grocery store or at a farmer's market, and then when people are presented nice, clean, shiny, well-presented produce, that they will make the choice to put those things on their table. And lo and behold, that really is true. People want to eat healthy. It doesn't matter what your income is. People want to make the right choices. People are making choices, wrong choices necessarily, or different choices, not because they don't want to. It's based on access. It's based on price. And it's based on availability. So when you make something available to people, they will actually make the choice we want them to make. So all that is to say that low-income folks, people in poverty, people in need, are no different than the main population, in that they want to eat healthy. They understand what good food means to their family, and they know how to cook. And so, in fact, some of them know how to cook better than a lot of people in mainstream society.
Yeah, Chris?
Pretty much people in mainstream society, regardless, have forgotten how to cook, and we're kind of relearning that as we're seeing now during the COVID pandemic as well, people cooking at home, and I'm doing that. So that is all to say, sort of pushed me towards this healthier food. When I left CAC in 2014, I went to Fair Share CSA Coalition. That's a network of organic CSA farms in central and southern Wisconsin. Sort of pushed me a little further towards healthy eating. That job was not a good fit for me. It was more of a marketing job. I was not really a marketing guy, but what I did learn in that job, is I made lots of great connections with local farms and farmers. And what I learned from them is when growing food, there's always going to be a time when there's going to be excess on the farm. You grow more than what you need, especially with a CSA farm. You have 400 customers that you need to serve. You grow more than enough food to make sure you can serve all 400. Crop comes in, it's good. You have beans in excess of being able to deliver those 400. What are you going to do with the extra ones? They would like to donate them, but I learned, but they were too busy to figure out where it could go. They're also in talking to Second Harvest, and I will say a few things about Second Harvest, and just keep in mind that when I say these things about Second Harvest, I'm not trying to put them down. It's just a different model. They're a national model that are very good at doing certain things, but not necessarily other things. So one of the things that when farms called Second Harvest to try to donate the produce there, Second Harvest didn't want it and wouldn't come and pick it up because it wasn't in quantities enough that they thought it was worth their while. And so that led to the formation of Healthy Food for All. When I left Fair Share CSA Coalition, I knew that there were farms that had excess produce. They wanted to donate, and if we collect it, figure out a system to collect it and get it into the system, we would add a lot of value to our local emergency food system. And so that really was the impetus for starting Healthy Food for All. We started in 2015 in the summer, basically collecting from excess from local farms. So when we talk about, that's where we started in 2015. In the fall of 2015, we were approached by Epic Systems. Epic has a annual worldwide users group event in the fall. They bring 10,000 of their clients into town and train them, show them around, and feed them really well. In doing so, they always end up with all this excess food, and so they were looking at a way of not throwing it out, and approached us and said, would we be willing to accept it and do something with it and figure it out. We hemmed and hawed, but we decided, let's go for it. Why not? So that first year, we got 2,600 pounds of pretty much bulk packed. When I say bulk packed in big aluminum pans, hotel pans, things like salads, meats, grilled vegetables, things like that. That food was not packaged in a way that could be handled by a food pantry. The pans were too large. And the reality was, people say, well, just give it to a community meal site and they'll feed it to people. But the reality was there was way too much even for a community meal site to use. And so basically with prepared food, you have about 7 days to use it, and then it has to be thrown out. So you would do the same thing at home, right? If you have a leftover, hopefully eat it the next day or two. If it remains up to a week, you're going to be throwing it out, or you should be throwing it out. And so what we did was we formed a partnership with Feed Kitchens. We were not part of Feed Kitchens at the time, to come in and use their commercial kitchen space and repackage the food. So we had volunteers, we got all kinds of deli packages, clamshells, soup containers, then brought people in, and then as food came in, we would sort of triage it, say, what do we have here? How would this best be packaged? We worked with Epic. They gave us their ingredient list for anything that they were donating, and so we were able to put an ingredient list on the package, label it, date it, and then get it out to people. That ended up being a huge success. I can remember bringing fresh cut fruit salad to St. Vinny's food pantry. It was the Friday before Labor Day weekend, and I had just bins and bins of quart-packed cut fruit, and people were standing in line waiting to go into the food pantry, and they saw me carrying these in, and people got really excited almost immediately, like, oh, right, it's Labor Day weekend, and I can have fruit salad for my picnic. That's fantastic. Almost at that moment, I just realized, ooh, this is a big thing, and could be really good. So when that was done, we went back to doing our produce, and we go back to our regular work. And about 3 weeks later, Epic approached us and wanted to donate on a weekly basis. And so we then became a program that worked with excess produce and with prepared food from large cafeterias and events. So we are certainly not the only food recovery game in town. And I said when I was working with Community Action Coalition, they have a food recovery program called the CAC Gleaners. They focus on kind of the retail level food. So food out of a deli, out of a grocery store that's already packaged in sort of a smaller package, that has been pulled off the shelf, can be picked up and taken immediately to a food pantry and can be distributed because it's already packaged in a way that a consumer can use it. What wasn't happening was what was happening to all these sort of bulk food that's coming out of a concert or a football game or a golf tournament or a wedding, street fair, you name it. And so that's the food that we're focused on capturing. We recognize that we have a very specific place in the food system. We are not a food pantry. We don't deal with packaged foods. We don't send out pallets of canned peaches or anything like that. But we do work on capturing what's available locally that otherwise would be tossed away because no one can figure out a way to use it. And so that's been our focus. Paula, you threw out some statistics of the amount of food that we collected. I think you said in 2018. I think just yesterday I figured out what we've done since 2015, and we're close to about 500,000 pounds. Now, if you were to talk to Second Harvest or something, 500,000 pounds is kind of a drop in the bucket to them. They can move a couple semis full of food and be set. But what we're doing is helping to reduce food waste using local foods and feeding hungry people. So I'm going to sort of back up for a moment and just talk about food waste in general.
And
food
Chris,
waste is a huge issue. In the United States, 40% of all food that is grown is never eaten. I paused right there because that's a huge number, right? 40%. And I was actually just on a phone call yesterday with folks in the Northeast Sustainability, and that number is still, that's the number that's being used. So if you think of that 40% of food that's being grown, and we talk about the number of hungry people that are in the United States, and that number right now with the pandemic is growing, or the number of hungry people throughout the world, and how are we going to feed them? There's always talk about kind of more sort of industrial agriculture. So growing more, using more inputs, using more chemicals, using GMOs, using hybrid seeds, trying to get more production per acre so that we can feed more people, and that's the only answer. When the reality is, if 40% of what we're already producing is going to waste, it seems silly to try to produce even more without correcting the current system. So when you're looking at 40% of the food going to waste, that's not just the food. And when we're talking about farm production, I want to be careful when I use the word waste as well, because I would say, it's waste because it's not ending up in someone's belly or on someone's table. But a farmer may not look at that as waste and may take exception to calling it waste because it can always be plowed back into the ground and used to fertilize the soil, if nothing else. So it does become compost when it's on a farm. But a farmer is going to also probably going to think of that as waste because it's not just the food, it's that farmer's time, it's his effort, it's the inputs, it's the seed, it's the water, it's any fertilizer, it's the fuel for the tractor, it's fuel for the trucks, it's packaging. So all of that stuff is being wasted, not just the food. And so when we talk about major issues with sustainability, when we're tossing out or not using food, we're wasting a lot of other resources as well that could be used for other things, and the land itself that's being used. So 40% of food is being wasted. Food waste is a huge issue. From on the farm, what they predict, what they say is not predict. Studies show is about 10% of all food waste in the United States is farm-based. That's only 10%. So we think about food waste. Where is food waste really happening? Food waste is really happening at consumer-facing businesses, so grocery stores and restaurants, and at home. Those are going to be the biggest wasters of food. Why is food waste an issue besides the wasted resources and the wasted food and hungry people? If food ends up in a landfill and is just composting or breaking down anaerobically, that means without oxygen, as it does that, it releases methane gas. Methane gas that escapes from a landfill into the atmosphere is a greenhouse gas, and so it contributes to the warming of the climate in the atmosphere. So it does become a big issue. In the book Drawn Down, it was released about a year and a half ago. I can't remember the author right now, and I'm not sitting next to my desk. But take a look at it. What they do is they took a bunch of scientists, data people, researchers, and kind of looked at all the studies and ways, in looking at ways, what are the most effective ways of mitigating climate change and bringing it down. And what they determined was that the third most effective strategy for mitigating climate change was the reduction of food waste. And so when we talk about food waste, we're not talking about just feeding hungry people. We're talking about having a major impact on climate change and greenhouse gases. Now, reducing food waste, when you look around the world, it looks different in different places, and it becomes a different issue. In the United States, it really becomes an issue of overproduction and lack of infrastructure. So we have cheap food, we produce a lot of it, we move it out, but we don't really have a good infrastructure for dealing with the waste. It's just sort of this byproduct, social cost. We'll push it off on future generations by throwing it in the landfill. In other parts of the world, the food waste may be because a lack of resources for food storage. So it may be a lack of coolers, it might be a lack of freezers, it might be a lack of just processing and preserving. And so the way we attack those issues in different places looks different. So if you might working with some aid agencies, food waste reduction in some places might be solar dehydrators that allow communities to dehydrate their harvest so that it can be saved for future use instead of, use as much as you can right now before it spoils. But in the United States, it really becomes a matter of infrastructure. And I think that our project here at Healthy Food for All really demonstrates the need for infrastructure. We're not purchasing any food. Our budget is about $60,000, $60,000 to $70,000 a year. So we don't even have a full-time staff person. They have me, and then I have another guy, and then it's all volunteers after that. And so what we're doing with that fairly small amount of money relative to a lot of other operations and small amount of staff and a lot of volunteers is we're moving lots of food. And so what it shows is if you have space, we have feed kitchens, we have a commercial kitchen space, we have a safe place to handle food, we have access to coolers, we have access to transportation. So we have a nice van that Dane County has supplied us. And so with those things, in having been working in the food system since the early 2000s and being familiar with lots of different players, we can find food. Food comes to us. I can tell you all kinds of strange stories about 8,000 pounds of roasted cashews that had a flavor powdering on it, but the flavor profile was slightly off, and so they were going to all be dumped in a landfill. 8,000 pounds. And so we took them and packaged them up and got them distributed.
Chris?
That's just one example. There's lots of examples of.
Chris, can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
So is your when you're talking about the van that you have in the distribution, are you solely distributing through food pantries? So when you get that, glut of nuts, or when you decide to repackage food from the Epic, is your distributors basically local food pantries?
Some of them are, but actually we have, so that's a really good question. And you're going to lead me down a whole different path with that one. What we have also learned is, so definitely we supply food pantries. Just before I got on this call this morning, I had the Goodman Community Center here, and they were picking up a bunch of fresh produce from us that we had procured. Tomorrow morning it'll be the East Madison Community Center. Then the cook, the chef from the Beacon, stops over. That's the day shelter for homeless folks on East Wash,
Right.
and she'll
Right.
check in to see what we have that she can use to make lunches with. So that certainly is one way that we distribute food. But another way that we've started distributing is sort of direct to households. And that looks different depending on where we're taking it, but we go to low-income senior centers, where and we bring food in and we just kind of set it out on a table, and then they have figured out how to kind of divvy it up and make it available to everybody there. We take it to just regular community centers that may or may not have a food pantry and just put food out. So what we're trying to do is get food directly to people at a time when it is still fresh and available. The food that we have is for the most part very perishable. So if it's prepared food, it has 7 days from the time we pack it to get it out. And if it's fresh produce, obviously the time is going to vary, but it's generally pretty short, unless it's a winter storage crop like a squash or an onion or something. But if it's a leafy green, we might have 2 or 3 days, and that's that. So we can't be just sitting on stuff and acting like a warehouse. We have to act like a distributor and get it out. So that's what we are doing, and I think where we're set up really nicely for the pandemic is because we figured those things out. We can kind of figure out how to get food directly to people, and that's during the pandemic. Our job has changed a little bit. So as you can imagine, with event cancellations, meaning street fairs, weddings, festivals, you name it, and a lot of big employers kind of shutting down and people working from home, so no food in cafeterias either. We're not getting that prepared food anymore. When the Safer at Home first started in March, we got lots of calls from places that were shutting down and, well, they had all this food in the coolers. Could we come and get it? And we just literally got tons of food. That lasted for about a week and a half, and then it was just done. And we moved a lot of food during that time. Required a lot of sorting because we were just taking everything. So if people had open jars of salad dressing, we would take them and then sort of sort through them here and go, well, it's already been opened. We don't know what's happened to it. It's probably not safe to, or we don't feel like that's safe enough to do something with and distribute. So we do have to make some decisions like that as well. And so since that time, we have been working with local farms. When we first started, we thought that local farms may not have stuff to donate, or that they were going to be not wanting to donate because they needed to make all the sales that they could to support themselves. What we're finding as time goes on is local farms actually, not that we want a pandemic to help the economics of local farming, but it has made a difference. So CSA, which has been community supported agriculture, which has sort of been on a downslide for maybe the last 7-8 years, suddenly is on a big upswing. People are way into CSA. I want home delivery. I want fresh vegetables. Boom, take it. It was on a downslide because farmers markets, there's just lots of other ways people get fresh produce without joining a CSA and committing themselves up front, but much more popular. So what we're finding is farmers are actually, and I don't want to say they're getting rich or they're doing really great, but they're doing a lot better than we thought they might be doing. And so we're getting actually some really nice donations from local farms. Local farms are also being boosted because there has been grants that have been allowing food banks to purchase items from those farms. So Second Harvest got a few $1 million to make purchases from local farms and then distribute that. Where we come in on that is we have the distribution. We know how to do that. So this is another sort of seeming knock on Second Harvest, but it's not really a knock. It's just the reality of their model. Their model is to take truckloads of stuff, drop pallets of food pantries, let food pantries sort through it, distribute it. As they're buying all this produce and getting more donations, food pantries are actually right now distributing less and less of the perishable stuff because it's drive-up food pantry. Normally a food pantry, you'd go in, you'd shop around just like a grocery store. But right now it's drive up, here's a bag of food, see you later, right? And so it's no shopping. It's very hard to distribute perishable stuff on that way. And so Second Harvest was struggling to distribute. They could buy the local produce, but they're struggling to distribute it. So we're actually partnering with them right now. And instead of doing sort of our normal food rescue and recovery, we are acting as a distributor for Second Harvest. So we're going in there and kind of going into the coolers, pulling out the produce, and making sure it gets out into neighborhoods, which has been sort of a lesson learned in the pandemic of kind of realizing where there are weak points of infrastructure and storage and distribution are going to be constant sort of sore points, not just in the emergency food system, but even in just sort of a local food system. If you think of how CSA farms and local farms get fresh vegetables to grocery stores and restaurants in our community, it's all through individual distribution farms loading up their trucks and coming into town and making 10 stops. We have no central warehouse. We have no food hub where farms can just take their product in, it goes on an inventory list, and then a vendor can pull that out. And so that's a big weak point, and that's been kind of laid bare during the pandemic as we figure out, as we see sort of rolling shortages of certain kinds of food and the inability to access it. So that's a point that would need correcting. So I'm going to stop there, make sure there's no other questions, or if anyone has questions. I feel like I've sort of been, I don't know if I've been all over the map. Again, I can't see your faces.
Yeah, well, we'll pipe in and ask questions. I think Jim has a question, and Marilyn. So Jim, you go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a little bit about. Wanted to ask you about gardens. Sure. When I was a kid, sure, everybody had a victory garden during the Second World War, and everybody was encouraged to have gardens, and lots of people did. When we moved to Madison, which is many years later, I planted a garden, and I've had a garden every summer except this year, when because of the pandemic and things, and I was getting kind of too old to do that. But having a garden right in the backyard so I can go out and get fresh produce was, really a big advantage. In terms of not only saving, money, but also time. Didn't have to go shopping for cucumbers and onions and things. But now there was talk of these community gardens, and I think they have one over at Hammersley Park, which is the one over by the library, by Meadow Ridge Library, that seems to be functioning. And I go by there, there's lots of things growing. But I don't understand why there was never a community garden in Pilgrim Park. Pilgrim Park just off of Ravenswood, just off of sure, it's Pilgrim Park by Pilgrim Road, which is just one back from Raymond Road. There's a big green area there. Yep. They have a baseball net, baseball setup, but nobody ever plays baseball there. They do have a
no one ever plays.
Yeah, I've never seen anybody playing baseball in the baseball diamond. Kids do use the basketball court, but the big green area that stretches all the way over to McKenna, this would be a perfect place for a community garden, and housing is surrounding the entire area, and it's all kinds of housing. I mean, we have the kind of upscale yuppie neighborhoodies like where we live, but it's also, they have a lot of these low income houses along Raymond Road. Lots of people would have access to a garden there, but how come nobody's ever put one in?
So here, that's a really good question. And actually, I know, having been at CAC and run the community garden program, I can answer that pretty intelligently. When we saw the economic downturn in 2008, there was a huge push towards growing your own food because of the food shortages and because of more people going hungry and needing economic help. We, with the help of Madison Community Foundation at that time, there was a major expansion of community gardens. That was now 12 years ago. Since that time, there's been no real expansion of community gardens in Madison. There's been a switch as to who oversees the community garden program. So when I was at Community Action Coalition, it was Community Action Coalition. As I was leaving Community Action Coalition, CAC was actually giving up the program. They didn't want to run it anymore. Actually, it was one of the reasons why I left. And it went to basically being run by three organizations, one being Dane County Extension, one being the City of Madison, and one being Troy Gardens Community Groundworks, or now called Rooted. And it was the program has always been way underfunded, and so basically Rooted had one staff person who could oversee the number of community gardens that existed in the City of Madison, and that was just almost impossible. Because basically what you're trying to do is get gardens in, you're trying to develop leadership within that garden so the garden can self-operate and make sure they have the resources. So a new community garden in the City of Madison right now is only going to start if there's a push from the neighborhood itself. So if people in the neighborhood come together and say, look at Pilgrim Park, that's a perfect spot for a garden, who wants to garden, let's get together and approach the city and get this going. People don't know that, right? So they don't know that they have the ability to say, looking at a piece of parkland and saying a garden should be there, and there's actually a process that could make one happen. And so there really needs to be more outreach, more public education about that ability. What we saw this year, I actually coordinated a community garden in my neighborhood, which is the Far East Side Elvia neighborhood, right across the street from my house. And you're right, it's fantastic to grow your own food, and not only that, but when you grow it yourself, your kids eat it, or when they help, they eat it. So this year with the pandemic, there's been renewed interest in gardening, and you may have read articles or experienced it yourself. You went to the garden center and you couldn't find your seeds, you couldn't find your bedding plants because everyone was buying stuff up. And I know that community gardens that had plots in them, their plots were basically rented out. So sometimes you might see a community garden that has a few plots that don't get rented, where there's just not enough demand. Not the case this year. Every plot is being rented. The city is going about. So one of the other things that I do is I'm on the City of Madison Food Policy Council. I've been on it since it was conceived in 2012. The Food Policy Council is now going through sort of a response to the pandemic and what are the things that the city can do, and one of them is expansion of community gardens and the ability, and not just community gardens, but also pushing home gardeners, supporting that, so that people have access to food. And so there's going to be a push for community garden expansion, but what that looks like, I'm not exactly sure, because without the staff to help with those expansions, or without any sort of outreach to let people know that you can make gardens happen, I don't know how that occurs. I know that my garden is expanding. We're going to be adding 8 new plots for next year. So that's the best answer I can give you. There is a process, people just aren't aware of it. And if you're not aware of it, you can't take advantage of it.
Go ahead, Marilyn.
Well, I have 2 comments. One, I'd like to piggyback on what Jim was asking Chris. And perhaps the local alders need to be aware. They may not be aware that neighbors can come together and request some land to be designated a community garden. So that might be one place for outreach, and either letting the different neighborhood communities know about it, or at least the alders. That could be something
Right.
they can
No,
offer.
that's a really good suggestion. I think you sort of assume that because they're alders, they know those things, but they very well may not.
They may not. My
You
second,
don't know what you don't know, right?
right. And well, and sometimes things become more important than other times. And this might be
Right.
one of those important times for outreach by the alders. The other question I have, I notice on the screen, there's a place that says donors. How can people in the community make donations? For example, I've made in memory donations to Second Harvest. I was unaware of your agency, or whatever you want to call it.
Healthy Food for All. Yeah, we're pretty
program.
low profile.
So how would somebody go about making a monetary donation?
So Healthy Food for All. When we first started, we were under the Center for Community Stewardship, and we were kind of incubated under their umbrella. We ran it as an independent thing. As we sort of started working more at Feed, we just got into a discussion with Feed Kitchens about just belonging here, being a good fit here. Feed is run by the Madison Northside Planning Council. So we became an official program of the Madison Northside Planning Council and embedded in Feed Kitchens. And so we are kind of a low-key program. We do struggle for that notoriety, and we know that we have we can do a lot with a very limited budget. So we do outreach for try to get individual donors. Again, it's hard to get good airtime when you're competing against really good programs like Second Harvest or the big food pantries, the River, Goodman Center, St. Vinny's. So we do try to do outreach. We try to do talks like this. And we do reach out to, we've been well supported by local foundations. I do have to say, when we first started, the Goodman Foundation was a big supporter of us. I think we got an initial, when we started with a budget of about $4,000 that we just collected from people. And then as we were getting successful over the summer, people kind of found out about us, and we started getting approached for more information. Then we did get the support from the Goodman Foundation. That foundational support was important because it sort of gives you that legitimacy to other folks, and then we could reach out in other ways. And so we have been, I would say that we've got everything that we need, because you never want to say that, and it's certainly not true, but we've been fairly well supported. We just have to, we need to figure out it, because we know when we tell a story, people get interested in it. We just have to figure out a way of how do two part-time people find the time to get out and tell this. So that's a really good question. Otherwise, try to direct people to our website, do Facebook outreach, and do talks.
Yeah. So
One of the other things I'll just comment briefly is you mentioned that it was the taking care of the waste was a third most important way to help mitigate climate change. And I would
Correct.
think this would be, I would not have thought about that. And there are other groups in Madison that their main concern is climate change and its effect on health, on the weather patterns, on agriculture, on a lot of our ways of living. And I would think maybe, other people aren't aware as well. And that might be a good entree into letting them know about your program.
Yep, yeah, that is a really good suggestion. And actually, pre-pandemic, we were kind of strategizing around that whole messaging piece and saying, we need to be not just messaging for feeding hungry people, we also need to be messaging about mitigating climate change. Obviously, during the pandemic, everything has become just a little bit more difficult. And but very good suggestion, and definitely. I did last fall. I was able to give a talk to Wisconsin Academy for Science, and that was kind of that getting in front of those people that you're talking about. People who are more worried about climate change than, not that people aren't worried about hungry people, but we all have sort of our the major issue that we care about.
I have another comment.
Most definitely. Yep, go ahead.
Back to gardens. When we first moved out here, there was a cornfield in the backyard, and I had lots of sunlight. When I planted things in the garden, they really did well. But in the meantime, the city made that into a greenway. They planted some trees, which were little tiny trees, and I planted some trees, which were little tiny trees. And over the years, those trees get bigger and bigger, and pretty soon, or not pretty soon, but over the decades, they cast a lot of shade on the garden, to the point where one reason I didn't bother to plant this year is because every year I get fewer and fewer, less and less produce out of the garden because of the shading of the trees. But these are and particularly the trees that do the most shading are the ones that the city planted in the greenway. So everybody is supposed to be tree huggers, and we're supposed to love trees, but there is a conflict between trees and growing your own food. If your yard is shaded by the city's trees, it shuts off your ability to have your own garden. But in a bigger scale, I see something in the paper about a huge solar array going into somewhere in Dane County, and it's a massive thing. They had a picture of it in the paper. Well, that's land that you can't use for anything else. If you cover the land with solar panels, you can't grow food on it. And sometime there's going to be a conflict between energy and food, I think, if population keeps expanding. Wisconsin is not a particularly good place for sunlight, as you must know. First of all, we're far enough north that in the wintertime, we don't get nearly as much sun as we do in the summer. So there's a huge variation in the amount of electricity you can produce, even under the most ideal conditions, between summer and winter. And then in addition, we get a lot of cloudy weather and rainy and all. If you really want solar energy, you should be thinking in terms of the desert Southwest. And that requires transmission lines. But Wisconsin is not very well suited for solar energy, and it competes with agriculture. And Wisconsin is not really very well situated for wind energy either. The wind doesn't really, as a sailor, I know that the winds are not very reliable in Wisconsin. Have many very calm days. They have a lot of days when it kind of fluctuates between not enough wind to generate, to run their turbines, or so much wind that you'd have to scale back your turbines to keep them from overloading. So if you want wind energy, you should be thinking in terms of the Great Plains states. And I hear people saying, well, look at Iowa, they're doing much better in renewable energy and wind energy than Wisconsin. And the answer is partly, because the wind blows a lot more in Iowa than it does in Wisconsin. You can't make wind energy if the wind doesn't blow, and you can't make solar energy if the sun don't shine. So people, don't seem to.
So you bring up a good point about, there's certainly things that work in conflict with each other, and you have to sort of figure out what is the best balance. Trees that's an important point, because as we want to push maybe the city and parkland, or and it's not just parkland, there's lots of other types of land that the city owns, engineering land, right of ways, water utility land. We can look at those and put community gardens on them. But if we don't have all parts of the city working together on that, it can fall apart really quickly. An example of my own community garden at it's at the LVM Park. We kind of bought up to the LVM Conservancy. At the edge, over time, our garden has been there. This is our 7th year. Over time, the Conservancy sort of tends to kind of push out a little bit. You know, the kind of grasses on the edge, the tree branches that are hanging over. Come to find out, people that oversee the Conservancy are different from the people who oversee the park. And while the park might be amenable to gardens and see them as a useful use of garden space, people that run the Conservancy really don't give it much thought, right? That's not their problem. I'm trying to take care of this Conservancy. The other thing, the people that run the Conservancy or streets or just all of the kind of tree arbor maintenance in the city is they don't like to put a saw into anything. They don't want to cut a tree down. They don't want to trim a tree if they don't have to. And so it really becomes kind of this difficult conversation of who am I even supposed to be talking to about this, and how can I get them to understand that this is an important thing to do, and it's going to really help sort of the larger picture to make a few cuts. We're looking right now in my community garden at these walnut trees that are growing up and just getting bigger and bigger and kind of hanging over the garden. So people that are on the edge of the garden near the walnuts are like, I can't grow anything anymore. So it does become an issue. And until sort of we got everybody sort of on the same page and moving together, there's always going to be kind of those little conflicts of how to make it work.
So Chris, do you have relations with individual community gardens too that supply you? Yes, yep. In fact, I just had a gentleman this morning stop and drop some stuff off from a garden. My own garden has a donation bin that folks donate, and right now it's filling up with zucchini, tomatoes, green beans. So yeah, I think most community gardens in Madison, I don't want to say all of them, have some relationship either with us or with a local food pantry that they can supply. Yeah. And so do you wash and sort all that stuff and then deliver them?
Yep. So what we do here at Feed is we'll wash and aggregate, basically sort everything and then get it out to folks because we want it to look as nice as possible. If it comes from a garden to a food pantry, I think what the food pantry would prefer is if the person donating it can get it washed up and looking nice. Because food pantries sometimes just struggle for the proper equipment, proper resources to be able to handle some of that kind of stuff. Some food pantries can do it, some food pantries not. And so sort of my experience with food pantries has been if they don't have the resources and somebody pulls a bunch of beets out of the ground, they're just going to set the beets out as is and hope someone takes them. Now, if I'm shopping and I see a pile of nice shiny red beets that are glistening and then another pile of beets that are kind of caked with dirt and mud and there's some brown leaves on them, which ones am I going to take? Mm-hmm. We're naturally going to take the shiny ones and leave the dirty ones there. And so it's just helpful for marketing aspects to get that cleaned up.
I got a question about local farms too. I remember in the past that some of the local farmers would have a temporary little stand set up in the summertime. Maybe they would be in the spring selling strawberries and asparagus, and by the time fall comes around, they're doing squash. And I don't know that I know where those are anymore. Are they still doing those? Ooster something was one of the farms that used to have
out of Stoughton.
And also, is there Peck's? Somehow the name Peck's comes to mind with having little
There's Peck's and Heck's. They're both out by Spring Green or Arena.
But they used to have a food stand.
I don't know what's happening this year. Eggster's used to have one right down the street from my house, and I haven't seen it yet this year. Now, this would be about the time that they would be setting up because sweet corn, melons, tomatoes.
But they usually start off in the spring
And
when the asparagus and the radishes and things
Right.
are going, and then they continue into the fall when it's the the squash. And it's
Right.
nowadays, especially, I'd be more inclined to want to shop there because, first of all, it's outdoors. It's right out in the open. You
Outdoors.
don't want
You're
to
not
be
struggling
in an
with other
enclosed
people.
building where everybody's breathing out their viruses. So
Right. No, I hear you, and I don't know. I guess probably one of the things that may, at least in Madison, we went out for a drive, and we were up in Sauk in Iowa County just driving around because what else is there to do? And I noticed how many different farms had stands at the end of the driveways. You don't see that in
virtually
Dane
every farm had something for sale
Right.
right at the end of their driveway.
Right.
But
In Dane County, I think maybe what the issue has become is that there's so many farmers markets. I mean, you can find a farmers market daily in Dane County, and on some days you can find multiple farmers markets. And so that puts a lot of pressure on farmers who, not necessarily because they make the choice of either of going to the market or not going to the market, but when you're going to markets all the time, you might have less time to set up a stand. I don't know necessarily, I don't have the answer to your question, but that might be one of them. I do hear from farmers who do say, there's just too many markets. I can't do all these markets and still harvest food on my farm. Do one or the other. So it's a good observation, and I don't, that's my best guess as to why we don't see more of them locally.
Go ahead, Marilyn.
I was just going to say that I have another appointment, but I wanted to thank Chris so much for his presentation. I learned a lot. I think everybody did. And good luck. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you. You're welcome. I appreciate the feedback because I feel like I'm just talking to an empty room on a telephone. So thank you for hanging in there with me and listening.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. Okay, Chris.
Yes.
Thank you for coming on and helping with us. And I did record that so I can, if you want to listen or use any parts of it, I'll send you the link when I get it, when I create it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Yes, I'd be interested.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, and I don't know if I was showing people the